The Mythology of Alchemists, a short essay written and read by Bruce Mills, otherwise known as the Obligate Pedestrian. A common myth states that the medieval alchemists were mystics, or if you follow Carl Jung, self-help therapists. In the 21st century, there is quantum theory and there are books on the quantum mysticism. There is even writing on quantum psychology, but despite this literature, quantum theory is not said to be pseudoscience, as it is recognised that there are different people using the term quantum in different ways. The core of the quantum theory is an empirical rationalist science. The other material is parasitic. It is my contention in this posting that the core of historical alchemy, the alchemy that actually practiced by those who were called and called themselves alchemists, was also empirical rationalist science, and that this became apparent when the original texts are consulted. It will take a while to untangle all the socio-linguistic issues that lead to the idea that alchemists were frauds and mystics and ignorant monkeys who did not know any better. The most crucial question, one that rather bothered me until I found what seems to be the core of the answer, is why do we even have two words, chemistry and alchemy? The answer that one is a name for pseudoscience and the other for science does not stand up to further examination. It is often said that the physics of Aristotle is bad physics. It is stated in various books on mechanics that Aristotle had at best a pre-scientific view of the way that things move. Now, Carlo Rovelli might disagree and say that Aristotle physics works in its scope, but the same people who use the word alchemy for pseudoscience still allow that Aristotle had physics. He actually invented the term. So Aristotle physics might well be bad physics, but it is still physics, not physi. The same thing applies to mathematics. People say that the ancient Greek mathematics was good and the foundation of modern science, but look at the Egyptians and the Babylonians and complaints can be heard to the effect that mathematics was bad mathematics or primitive mathematics, but it's still mathematics, just not well developed. It is not almathy. If you feel that alchemy was bad chemistry, the question of why there are two different words remains, and there seems to be a very clear answer, which is that George Farmer was an intellectual snob. This requires some explaining. Georgius Agricola died on the 21st of November 1555 in Chemnitz, which, given our topic, is a rather curious coincidence. Because he rejected matters ecclesiastical, despite apparently holding strong pro-religious views, the local church refused to bury him and his body was carried to Zeitz, where he was buried in the cathedral. His plaque read as follows: To the physician and mayor of Chemnitz, Georgius Agricola, a man whose most distinguished piety and scholarship, who had rendered outstanding services to his city, whose legacy will bestow immortal glory on his name, whose spirit Christ himself absorbed into his eternal kingdom, his mourning wife and children. He died in the 62nd year of life on November the 21st, 1555, and was born in Glasgow on March the 21st, 1494. This plaque was actually stolen a century later. It does not, however, mention De Re Metallica. It is that book and the motives of the author that concern the story now. Agricola was the Latinized or pen name. His birth name was Georg Bauer. The surname Bauer means peasant farmer, so in English he was George the Farmer. In Latin that became Georgius Agricola and sounded much more impressive. Professionally, he was not a farmer but a pharmacist who introduced the concept of quarantine to Germany. More importantly, Agricola was in modern terms a self-taught mining engineer. Having spare time, he devoted himself to scholarly studies of the problems of mining, including smelting, digging, and the origin of ore in the ground. He wrote about it in 1530 in the book Bermanus, sive de re metallica dialogus, or Bermanus, a dialogue on metallurgy, usually just called Bermanus. This was highly praised at the time. Bermanus is the Latinized name of Lorenz Berman, which, as far as I can tell, means something like smart dude. He was a mining expert and a friend of Agricola. The book was written as a classical dialogue in which Bermanus is the hero. Bermanus, the book, was a prelude to the more complete and direct De Re Metallica written over the next 20 years and published the year after Agricola died. Which brings the topic back to alchemy. Clearly, alchemy is an old word. Its origins go back to the Greco-Egypt period as the word chem, possibly meaning black or possibly meaning metallurgy, and it passed through the Arabic peninsula where it resided for a few centuries and picked up the prefix al and also the sulfur and mercury theory of metals. Alchemy appears to have its origin in the study of plant-based dyes. It was applied by the Romans to attempts to colour metals, leading to an interest in metallurgy in the Islamic world, and also through the study of the plant potions to an interest in medicine. Who exactly was and was not an alchemist is not quite as clear as I might have implied earlier. Several people, including Agricola and the unrelated but roughly contemporary Paracelsus, actually distanced themselves from the alchemists. But this was not so much their studies did not come under the scope of alchemy, but rather more a matter of proclaiming that they had a different and better theory. Note, I could not find out a definitive pronunciation of chrysopeo, which means the manufacture of gold, so I've done my best here. At that time, the best funded research in alchemy was chrysopoeia, the making of gold. It was something like the particle physics of the day, although perhaps a comparison to fusion power socially would be closer. But despite that fundamental particle physics dominates much of the science in the 21st century, there are many other studies in science other than fundamental particles. Many who were against alchemy were rather more against the heavy funding being given to chrysopoeia and were actually actively engaged in activities that at the time were covered under the scope of alchemy. Similar claims about wrong science are made in modern science during times of paradigm shift. Undoubtedly, Agricola was a seed for the paradigm shifts of the next couple of centuries. Today, Agricola is not called an alchemist, largely because we still agree with him, while Paracelsus, despite his protestations, is often called an alchemist because we don't agree with him. Such is life. And using the word alchemist in this way and then claiming that alchemists were all pseudoscientific is circular. But what about the snobbery? Agricola has been mentioned as being a scholar and generally praised for it. He had a strong intellectual and pedantic sense. I'm not necessarily attacking him for that. I would often be accused of the same thing myself. It is a matter of caring about the details of the use of the language. But what he did had an interesting subsequent impact, one that he probably did not intend. Knowing that the word alchemy had its origin in the Greco-Egyptian chem, coupled with the Arabic el and the ending ia to produce alchemia, which became a single word alchemia in Latin, Agricola proposed that the l should be dropped because it was the Arabic definite article and not part of the core word that carried the meaning. Hence, in his writing, he used chemia instead of alchemia. The neologism was intended as a synonym, just one that virtual signalled, I know ancient languages. That was the Latin. What about the English? If translated into English, alchemia should have been alchemistry, if chemia became chemistry. The reason for the difference here is the slightly different route it took. The Latin alchemia was ported to the study alchemy. The Neo-Latin chemia first became chemist as a practitioner of the ancient study of alchemia, and then became chemistry in English as what chemists do. At the start of the 17th century, alchemy and chemistry were synonyms, just with a different nuance. These distinctions only a matter of socio-linguistic accident. The semantic nuance came from the fact that De Re Metallica was considered a magnum opus. It was used as the primary text for mining engineering for the next couple of hundred years. It was the first such book since the writings of Pliny the Elder, who died in the year of our Lord 79, and also wrote on the topic of mining and mineralogy. Pliny the Younger was his son, who wrote a critique on the up-and-coming Christian religion. This does not concern us here. This meant that if one worked in alchemy, but if you saw yourself as aligned with the future, let's say the Democrats in the USA, one used chemia to signal that you had read De Re Metallica and you were up with the latest ideas. But if one wanted to align with the qualities of tradition and the past, say the Republicans in the USA, then one eschewed Agricola's neologism in favour of alchemia, which had been the standard in Latin for hundreds of years. This was the state in 1630, but by 1730 the words had diverged in meaning, especially because there were two words allowing this to happen. And as one might imagine, the word for traditionalism was elided into the word for ignorant monkey who does not know any better, especially since Europe at the time was aligning itself strongly with technological superiority and invading the rest of the world. As a result, it became popular to denigrate the work of the past as being useless and surpassed. In the 1600s, for example, it was declared that the mathematics of the moderns had now surpassed the mathematics of the ancients and was heading out into the world to make its own life. Several advances in chemistry in the 1700s were explicitly promoted as being a new understanding and a demonstration of the principle that the future owed nothing to the past and was entirely the credit of the present. Similar behaviour and beliefs can be traced in the history of the study of the solar system, especially in the views of the works of Copernicus, Galileo and Newton. But that is outside the scope of this story for now. That is the skeleton of the idea. There's much flesh that needs to be placed on those dry bones. For example, the idea that alchemy is entirely about obscure magical diagrams of kings and griffins seem to have come mostly from popular science books of the 17th century that were written and read about in the same way that quantum mysticism is written and read about in the 21st century. The idea that alchemists were somehow isolated fools trying to make gold by mystical, magical means is contradicted by the fact that in the 1500s and even up to the late 1600s with James II in England, that kings and queens in Europe were paying out large wads of cash to support royal research into the manufacture of artificial gold. The idea is not absurd if you suppose that gold is a compound, and the precise nature of gold as a chemical element was part of a theory that developed 100 years later. At the time, the theory suggested gold was a compound. Indeed, looking at the writings in alchemy from around 1300 to 1500, for example, the Summa Perfectionis of Pseudo-Geber, circa 1305, it seems that the notion that the alchemists had was rather similar in principle to the 20th century concept that every material is compound of protons, neutrons, electrons and photons, rather than a statement about what is called chemistry. Again, a bigger topic that needs to be expanded on later. There remains one more socio-linguistic point to make, and that involves Mr. Herbert Hoover, the 20th century mining engineer who became one of the presidents of the United States of America and had a dam named after him. He became important here because he and his wife completed the first translation of De Re Metallica into English in 1912. In the preface to De Re Metallica, Agricola dissed the alchemists, or rather, since he was into quasi-neologisms, the chemists, that is, those who practice chemia. In English, the chemists. And he said that they were misguided in trying to create gold from lead. But he was not neutral. He was a pharmacist with his own ideas and so in conflict with the apothecaries and the alchemists. He was also a friend of a mining engineer and a writer of books on the topic. He wanted to promote the mining industry. The conflict here is the exact same issue as the one between natural and artificial in the 21st century. Some people eschew artificial medicines and demand natural medicines or natural foods. Whether or not there is a justification for this is a side issue here. In the 1500s, gold was used as a medicine. It was argued that artificial gold, if it could be manufactured, should not be used in medicines as it might be harmful to the subtle humours of the human body. Agricola was promoting the idea that natural gold was better and at the same time pointing to the failure to manufacture gold as evidence research should not be funded, a move which promoted funding of mining. He was not a neutral observer, and his justification for the idea that gold might not be manufacturable was simply the failure so far to do it. While there is validity in this point of view, the same argument could be applied to fusion power in the 21st century. But fusion power is suggested by the extant theory, and it would be a great boon for us if we could get it right. So billions of dollars and pounds and ren are pushed into this research. And so too it was with gold in the 1500s. As a result of all the culture of alchemists being bad that was around in the later centuries, Hoover actually translated what in all senses was the Latin word for chemist to the English word alchemist, because in the preface Agricola was dissing those people. Now, even if one wants to, perhaps validly, argue that the modern world in English, this word alchemist, actually does mean pseudoscientific mysticism, this cannot be used to determine that people prior to 1700 who called themselves alchemists were being declared or declaring themselves to be mystics and charlatans. It was the word that included what in the 21st century includes the study of laboratory chemistry. And this too needs to be explained in great length to demonstrate from the details of the medieval literature exactly what it was that the alchemists really did. It is the intricate and interesting history that brings in everything from linguistics to quantum field theory.